When God engages with Abram, he references the stars. And of course, most of us live in so much light pollution. I remember once I was in college listening to a sports radio guy who, there were some scientists that said there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on all the beaches of the earth. And this sports guy said, that just can't be, you know? It's got to be trillions and trillions of grains of sand. And I look up in the night sky here in New York, and there's what, 8, 10 stars? And there's something to what it is we've experienced. And just because something isn't been in your experience doesn't make it not true, right? As an aside, I heard a bizarre podcast about a particular group of young people who have decided recently to challenge that Helen Keller was real. Not that she didn't exist as a human, but that there's no way that she was fully deaf and fully blind and then somehow learned to speak and wrote 12 books. That's just not possible, they say. And to listen to it, I was just kind of like, ooh. Just because you can't imagine it means it can't happen? That's not a good world to live in. It's certainly not a good world to be a believer in God in, you know. I think it was either Athanasius or Anselm that once said, if you can only believe in a God that you can comprehend, then you either have a really short creed or you have a really huge head. You know, which is it? That God has got to be beyond us. And so when God says to Abram, look up at the stars, count them if you can. When I was studying in Bolivia, there was something that happened in about a 72-hour period that included me multiple times assuming that I was going to die there. And but also in one of those nights was to look up into space and see something that I had really never seen before. And I only can compare it to like the Grand Canyon or maybe like St. Peter's in Rome, where most people have those moments where you're just like, it literally takes your breath away. And so for God to make this promise, but I want us to think about it. So God promises this, and it says Abram trusted him, and God credited that to him as righteousness. And then he promises land, and Abram says, how do I know I will possess that? I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like trust to me. You know, if Michael promises me a bunch of song books, and my response is, how do I know that you'll give me those song books? And some of you might go, well, come on, I said I would. You have to trust me. I know that you want those books, and I'm telling you I'm going to give them to you. Well, how do I know? And imagine if his response to that question was to say, I have the power to give you those books. Well, because that's what God does for Abram, right? Like he asked that question, and the response was power. But the reality is, in either example, the question isn't around the power of God to deliver the land or Michael to deliver the books. It's the reliability, isn't it? Can I rely on it? And then secondarily, these are all future promises in some level. What does descendants mean for Abram? What's he get out of it? Well, that's a whole other homily, but he has to think about his descendants as how he's going to live on. But the question becomes that why does God answer the question that way? Because this is really about a relationship. God's not trying to be his real estate agent. I think it was Eleanor Stump that made this point. He's not trying to be the real estate agent here. Like here, these are the two things you need. It's not a transactional relationship that God's starting. It's a personal relationship. And it's one that through human history, we as humans keep breaking and keep missing. And yet God keeps offering it. And look how much God celebrates that initial trust. That initial thing that God says, that's righteousness right there, that you're doing it. And that his very next sentence is a sentence of distrust. Doesn't put off God, does it? It doesn't put him off. And so the same for us in all of our relationships. That we have to understand that this God who's relational in a triune sense, this God that's relational, that relates to God's self, is now relating to us, is extending this opportunity for a relationship. Not a transactional one. That would be much more efficient, wouldn't it? There'd be more efficient ways to do a lot of the things we do as a church. We could just, if the pandemic taught us anything, you could think of it that way. It'd be much more efficient to just show all masses online, and we'll mail you the Eucharist, and you receive it at home. Bulk mailing, save us all kinds of money. Who needs a church? Who needs an address? Who needs the phone and the internet, all that? We'll just mail it to you. Except that that's not it. That's not the point. I've often said, God could have saved us any way he wanted, and he chose to do it this way, which is teaching us something about God and better be teaching us something about us. Better be teaching us about why relationships are important and not just the warm fuzzies of relationship. The hard points, the suffering, the struggle, the risk. If you attempt something, if you risk it, you can miss and you can fall and you can be hurt and you can be betrayed. These are all the things that can happen in relationship. And God never gives up on that. Not in God's self. That God, in discussing this, that it's the second person of the Trinity that says, I know what we can do. We keep offering this covenant, and they keep breaking it. Why don't I go down and fulfill their end of it? I'll become one of them. Yeah, we're going to do that because we love them. Not the universal them, the individual person. But I want them to be successful, the best sense of that word, to say I want them to know their value and their goodness. And if they see that done perfectly, if they see the covenant fulfilled, if they see the sacrifice that we participate in this Eucharist, it'll change all their relationships. It'll change all of their life. It will set them all free. And so when we contemplate in our own lives where we miss that, where we are not faithful, where we are not trusting in God, we think of this story of God in just a matter of seconds, right? Here, look at the stars. That's, your descendants will look like that. I trust in you. And God celebrates it. And the next words out of his mouth after the next promise are, how do I know? How do I know that? Sound familiar? And the God that knows that pattern of relationship in us is calling us to something deeper. And like I said, that has to happen in inefficient ways, in messy ways, in relational transactions that are not efficient. Most of my work in foreign missions, there are people that criticize it, right? There's more efficient ways to do that. Sure. Why do you take students there? Why don't you just send the money there? Because it's not really money that they need. First and foremost, they need to know their value. First and foremost, they need to know that people love them and believe in them. And there is something profound when someone you've never met comes and says that, not just with words, not just with a letter or an email, but with their very life, pitches their tent with you, lives with you, walks beside you, not in front of you, just walks right beside you. Well, that's priceless. You can't put a price on that. When you can get someone to the aha moment to say, oh, what you're saying is, I have value. Yep. And if we just try to do that efficiently, then yes, we'll just send a few checks. We'll just send a little bit of money. We'll just send the Eucharist in the mail. How ironic, huh? To say God is going to come to us and I will send it to you via FedEx or something. No. This story is so critical because it really begins this salvation history. And so, as we are just 2 weeks into Lent, we bring all of our relationships. We bring the ones that are hurting and suffering. Because when you love someone and they stumble, when you love someone and they don't love you back, when you love someone and they don't appreciate it, when you sacrifice for someone and they don't even seem to notice, that hurts. But the journey that we're on right now to Lent is the ultimate example of someone loving and sacrificing and laying it down. And many just walk right by it without ever looking at it. And that doesn't change the gift. That doesn't change the power of what it does for everyone. But it does require us, and we're on our way, we're doing our things, and we're all about our journey, to stop, to look, to meditate on how God has always been relational, how God is always extending this covenant to us, and that in Jesus Christ it is fulfilled. And so what brings us here this morning, why we have this beautiful space, is to come together, to be present to one another. And sometimes we're not good to each other, let's be honest. Sometimes we're tired, sometimes we're selfish, sometimes we're hurt, and hurt people. Amen? That's one of the things that happens. But no matter what, as we all sit in this space right now, we will all bring our focus to this altar of sacrifice, or the presence of Christ, this mystical action of his sacrifice we will participate in. And then we can bring all of our relationships, the ones that are warm and fuzzy, the ones that are cold and prickly, and say, Lord, I'm giving you these. And in response, he says, take me with you. Take my flesh within you, to be healed, to be strengthened, to be an instrument of love and peace and mercy. Otherwise, we're going to do it. We're just going to muscle our way through it. And we're not going to trust. We're going to keep questioning the reliability of God. The gospel ends with them, they didn't tell anyone anything for a long time. In part because they didn't quite understand what it was. But let us be people that heard this first story this morning to say, Lord, you keep offering this to me. Help me on my journey to know the lament of my sin, to know the steadfastness of your promise to me that's renewed every day. And help me in all of my relationships to point to that sacrifice, to point to that love, because it is the thing that will change our world, and it starts by changing us. May God be praised.